Hey there. Tonight, we're going to travel together through some of the quietest yet most powerful moments in human history. These are stories that changed the world, not with loud explosions or grand battles, but with whispers, secret meetings, and choices made in shadow. Betrayal is a word that carries weight, yet it's also a word that tells us something deep about people, about trust, and about the fragile threads that hold us together. Throughout time, there have been moments when someone turned away from a friend, a leader, or a cause, and in doing so, shifted the course of everything that came after. These stories are not always easy to hear, but they are important. They remind us of the complexity of being human, of the struggles we face when loyalty and survival collide, and of the quiet moments that echo through generations. So settle in, let your mind relax, and allow yourself to drift gently into these tales. There is no rush, no urgency, just stories told softly as the world around you fades into calm. Betrayal is as old as humanity itself. From the earliest days when people first gathered in tribes and communities, there was trust, and with trust came the possibility of its breaking. It's a universal experience, something that has touched every culture, every era, and every corner of the earth. When we think about betrayal, we often imagine grand acts, dramatic turns in history, but sometimes the most powerful betrayals are the quiet ones, the ones that happen in the heart before they ever reach the world. Tonight, we'll walk through these moments together, not to judge, but to understand. We'll see how betrayal shaped kingdoms, ended friendships, toppled empires, and changed the faith of millions. And as we move through these stories, let yourself feel the rhythm of history, the slow unfolding of events, the way one choice leads to another, like ripples moving across still water. This is a journey through time, and it begins long ago, in places where the world was still finding its shape. Long before nations rose and fell, before empires stretched across continents, there were small communities where people lived close to one another, where everyone knew everyone, and where trust was the foundation of survival. In those times, stories were passed down not through books, but through voices, around fires under stars. One of the oldest and most enduring stories of betrayal comes from such a time, a story that has been told and retold for thousands of years, woven into the fabric of faith and culture. It is the story of a man who walked beside a teacher, who listened to words of hope and love, and who, in the end, made a choice that would echo through all of history. This is the story of Judas Iscariot and the betrayal of Jesus Christ. In the ancient land of Judea, during a time when the Roman Empire stretched its powerful hand over much of the known world, there lived a man named Jesus. He was a teacher, a healer, someone who spoke in parables and drew crowds wherever he went. People listened to him because his words felt different, filled with compassion and a vision of a world where the last would be first, where the poor would be blessed, where love would conquer hate. Around him gathered 12 men, his closest followers, his disciples. They traveled with him, ate with him, learned from him. Among them was Judas Iscariot, a man whose name would become synonymous with betrayal itself. But before that moment, he was simply one of the 12, trusted enough to hold the money bag, to manage the small resources the group had. He walked the same dusty roads, witnessed the same miracles, heard the same teachings. What made him turn? What led him to the choice that would define him forever? The Gospels tell us that Judas went to the chief priests, the religious leaders who saw Jesus as a threat to their authority and to the fragile peace with Rome. He offered to lead them to Jesus, to point him out in a way that would allow them to arrest him quietly, away from the crowds who loved him. In exchange, he received 30 pieces of silver, a sum that has become a symbol of the price of betrayal. But perhaps the true betrayal was not in the silver, but in the kiss. In the Garden of Gethsemane, under the cover of night, Judas approached Jesus with a greeting, a kiss on the cheek, a sign that seemed like affection but was actually a signal to the soldiers waiting nearby. This kiss, so intimate, so personal, became the mark that led to Jesus' arrest, trial, and crucifixion. It's hard to imagine what passed through Judas's mind in that moment. Did he believe he was doing the right thing? Was he disillusioned, thinking that Jesus was not the leader he had hoped for? Or was it simply greed, a moment of weakness that spiraled beyond his control? What happened next is equally haunting. When Judas saw that Jesus was condemned to death, something shifted within him. The Gospels tell us that he was seized with remorse. He tried to return the silver, throwing it back at the priests, saying he had sinned by betraying innocent blood. But they did not care. The deed was done. The wheels were already in motion, and Judas, overcome with guilt and despair, went out and took his own life. The field where he died, bought with the blood money he had returned, became known as the Field of Blood, a place of sorrow and shame. His story did not end with redemption or forgiveness, but with a final act of despair. For 2,000 years, people have wondered about Judas. Some see him as the ultimate traitor, the one who sold out goodness itself. Others see him as a tragic figure, caught in a web of prophecy and fate, playing a role that perhaps had to be played for the story to unfold as it did. Regardless of how we see him, his name has become a symbol, a warning, a reminder of how trust can be broken and how the consequences of our choices can be far greater than we ever imagine. This story, told in churches and homes, in art and literature, has shaped the way people think about loyalty and betrayal. It reminds us that betrayal often comes not from strangers, but from those closest to us, from those we trust, from those who know us well. It also speaks to the mystery of human motivation, the way our inner conflicts, our fears, our disappointments, can lead us down paths we never intended to walk. Judas walked beside Jesus, heard his teachings of love and forgiveness, yet in the end, he could not forgive himself. His story is one of the first great betrayals recorded in the Western tradition, and it set the tone for countless others that would follow. As we move forward through history, we'll see this pattern again and again. The trusted friend who turns, the close companion who makes a choice that changes everything, the quiet moment that echoes loudly through time. Moving forward through the centuries, we find ourselves in the heart of the Roman Empire, a time when Rome was not just a city but the center of the known world, a place of power, ambition, and intrigue. It was a time of great leaders and great struggles, where the fate of millions rested in the hands of a few. And it was here, in the marble halls and shadowed streets of Rome, that one of history's most famous betrayals took place. This is the story of Julius Caesar and the men who called themselves his friends, yet who gathered in secret to plot his death. It is a story of ambition, fear, and the belief that sometimes, to save something, you must destroy it. Julius Caesar was not born into the highest ranks of Roman nobility, but through intelligence, military skill, and sheer force of will, he rose to become one of the most powerful men in the world. He conquered Gaul, crossed the Rubicon, and emerged victorious from a civil war that left him in control of Rome. He was loved by the common people, who saw him as a champion of their interests, but he was also feared by the Senate, the old guard of Roman aristocracy who saw his growing power as a threat to the republic they cherished. Caesar was named dictator, a title that in Rome meant supreme authority, and though he worked to reform the government to settle veterans to calendar reform, there were those who believed he wanted to become king, a title that was anathema to Romans who had driven out their kings centuries before. Among the senators were men who had fought beside Caesar, who had been his allies, his friends. Men like Brutus, whom Caesar is said to have loved almost like a son, and Cassius, a man driven by envy and principle in equal measure. They gathered in secret, a group of conspirators bound by the belief that they were saving Rome from tyranny. They called themselves the Liberators, convinced that by killing Caesar, they would restore the Republic. They did not act out of sudden anger or personal vendetta, but out of a calculated belief that this act of violence was necessary, even noble. They planned their move carefully, choosing a day when the Senate would meet, a day when Caesar would be surrounded by them, a day when there would be no escape. That day was the 15th of March, the Ides of March, a date that has lived in infamy ever since. On that morning, Caesar was warned. A seer had told him to beware the Ides of March. His wife, Calpurnia, had dreamed of his death and begged him not to go to the Senate. But Caesar, perhaps out of pride, perhaps out of a sense of duty, dismissed the warnings. He went to the Senate house, and there, surrounded by men he trusted, the attack began. It was not a clean, quick death. The conspirators fell upon him with daggers, stabbing him again and again. Caesar fought at first, trying to defend himself, but there were too many. In the chaos, he saw Brutus among the attackers, and it's said that he spoke his final words, not in Latin, but in Greek, words that have come down to us as a question filled with betrayal and heartbreak. Some accounts say he said, "Et Brute?" Meaning, "and you, Brutus?" Though historians debate the exact words. What is clear is that seeing Brutus among his killers was the final blow, more painful perhaps than any blade. Caesar pulled his toga over his head, surrendering to his fate, and fell at the base of a statue of Pompey, his old rival. He died from 23 stab wounds, surrounded by men who had once called him friend. The conspirators believed they had saved Rome, that the people would thank them, that the Republic would be restored. But they were wrong. The assassination did not bring peace or freedom. Instead, it brought chaos, civil war, and the end of the Republic they had tried to save. The people of Rome, who loved Caesar, were enraged. Mark Antony, Caesar's loyal friend, gave a speech at his funeral that turned the crowd against the conspirators. Brutus and Cassius fled Rome, and in the years that followed, they were hunted down and defeated. Brutus, trapped and facing capture, took his own life, unable to live with the consequences of what he had done. In the end, Rome did not return to its old ways. Instead, it became an empire, ruled by Caesar's adopted heir, Octavian, who would become Augustus, the first emperor. The betrayal of Caesar did not save the Republic. It destroyed it. What makes this betrayal so enduring, so compelling, is the complexity of it. These were not evil men plotting in darkness out of pure malice. They were educated, principled men who believed they were doing the right thing. They saw themselves as heroes, not villains. Yet their actions led to disaster both for themselves and for Rome. Brutus, in particular, has been remembered as the tragic figure of this story, the man torn between his love for Caesar and his love for Rome, who chose Rome and lost everything. Shakespeare immortalized this struggle in his play, presenting Brutus as an honorable man driven to a terrible act by his ideals. The phrase "Et Brute" has become shorthand for the pain of betrayal by a trusted friend, a moment when trust shatters and the world changes forever. Caesar's death reminds us that betrayal is rarely simple, that it often arises from conflicting loyalties, from the belief that a greater good justifies a terrible act. It also shows us that the consequences of betrayal can ripple far beyond the immediate moment, shaping history in ways the betrayers never intended. As the centuries rolled on and the Roman Empire eventually gave way to new kingdoms and cultures across Europe, the theme of betrayal continued to weave itself through the stories of power and family. In medieval times, when kingdoms were often divided among sons and brothers, when loyalty to family was paramount yet constantly tested, betrayal could come not from strangers, but from those who shared your blood. One such story comes from England, a land of castles and countryside, where two brothers found themselves on opposite sides of a struggle that would define their lives and their legacies. This is the story of William the Conqueror's sons, Robert Curthose and William Rufus, and the betrayals that marked the Norman royal family. When William the Conqueror died in the year 1087, he left behind a complicated legacy and an even more complicated family. He had conquered England in 1066, a feat that changed the course of history, bringing Norman rule to a land that had been Saxon. He was a strong king, feared and respected, but his sons were not like him. William had 3 sons who survived him, and he divided his lands among them in a way that sowed the seeds of conflict. To his eldest, Robert Curthose, he gave the Duchy of Normandy, the family's ancestral lands in France. To his second son, William Rufus, he gave the Kingdom of England, the crown and the power that came with it. To his youngest, Henry, he gave money but no land, a slight that would not be forgotten. This division was meant to preserve the family holdings, but instead, it created rivalry and resentment. Robert felt that, as the eldest, he should have received everything, especially England. William Rufus, meanwhile, saw himself as king and would not bow to his older brother. The stage was set for betrayal not once, but many times over. Robert Curthose was a proud man, a warrior who had fought alongside his father and who believed in his right to rule. But he was also known for his generosity, His easygoing nature, qualities that made him loved by his followers, but also made him a less effective ruler than his younger brother. William Rufus, by contrast, was ruthless, ambitious, and cunning. He ruled England with an iron hand, taxing heavily, controlling the church, making himself rich and his barons nervous. The two brothers were destined to clash, and they did, repeatedly. They made truces and broke them. They fought small wars and signed treaties that neither intended to keep. The betrayals between them were not single dramatic acts but a pattern of broken promises, shifting alliances, and the constant testing of loyalty. One of the most significant betrayals came when barons in England, many of whom held lands on both sides of the Channel, tried to play the brothers against each other. Some preferred Robert, seeing him as the rightful heir and a more lenient lord. They invited him to invade England, promising to support him against William Rufus. Robert agreed, seeing a chance to take what he believed was his. But the invasion failed. The promised support did not materialize as expected, and Robert found himself negotiating rather than conquering. A treaty was made between the brothers, one that was supposed to bring peace, but trust was already too damaged. They agreed that if one died without an heir, the other would inherit everything, cutting out their younger brother Henry entirely. But even this agreement was fragile, built on the shaky ground of mutual suspicion. William Rufus ruled for 13 more years after that treaty, and his reign was marked by constant tension, not just with his brother but with the church, with his barons, with almost everyone around him. He was not a well-loved king, but he was a powerful one. Then, in the year 1100, while hunting in the New Forest, William Rufus was killed by an arrow. The official story was that it was an accident, a stray shot fired by a nobleman named Walter Tyrrell. But many suspected it was not an accident at all. Some whispered that it was assassination, that someone had wanted him dead. And who benefited most from his death? Not Robert, who was away on crusade, far from England and unable to claim the throne quickly. No, it was their younger brother Henry, who had been waiting in the shadows, who had been slighted by his father's will, who moved with astonishing speed to seize the royal treasury and have himself crowned king within days. Whether Henry was involved in his brother's death remains a mystery, one of history's unsolved questions. But what is clear is that he betrayed Robert's claim. The treaty between William and Robert had said that the survivor would inherit everything, and Robert was still alive. But Henry did not wait. He took the throne, and when Robert finally returned from crusade and tried to claim England, Henry defeated him in battle, captured him, and imprisoned him for the rest of his life. Robert Curthose spent nearly 30 years in captivity, growing old in a castle while his younger brother ruled the lands that Robert believed should have been his. It was a betrayal not of a moment, but of a lifetime, a slow, grinding denial of what Robert saw as his birthright. This story of brothers who could not trust each other, who made and broke promises, who fought and schemed and ultimately destroyed each other's happiness, is a reminder that betrayal often happens within families, where love and ambition tangle together in painful ways. The Norman royal family, for all their power and success, could not escape the cycle of mistrust that their father's choices had set in motion. Each brother betrayed the others in different ways, through broken treaties, through seizing power, through choosing ambition over loyalty. And in the end, none of them found peace. William Rufus died violently. Robert Curthose died a prisoner. Henry ruled, but his reign was marked by the shadow of how he had taken the throne. Their story shows us that betrayal does not require enemies. Sometimes the people we betray are the ones we grew up with, the ones who should have been able to trust us most. In the same land of England, just a few generations later, another betrayal unfolded, one that would shake the church and the crown, one that would lead to murder in a sacred place and a friendship destroyed by power and pride. This is the story of King Henry II and Thomas Becket, two men who began as close friends, almost like brothers, and ended as bitter enemies. It is a story about loyalty tested by duty, about how the roles we take on can change us, and about the tragic consequences when personal bonds collide with public responsibility. It's also a story that reminds us that betrayal can be mutual, that both sides can feel betrayed, and that sometimes there is no clear villain, only two people who could not find a way to remain true to both their friendship and their principles. Henry II became King of England in 1154, inheriting a kingdom that had been torn apart by civil war. He was energetic, intelligent, and determined to restore order and strengthen royal power. He needed people he could trust, people who were capable and loyal. One of those people was Thomas Becket, a man of lower birth than most of the nobles around the king, but brilliant, charming, and utterly devoted to Henry. They became friends, close companions who hunted together, planned together, laughed together. Henry made Thomas his chancellor, the highest administrative office in the kingdom, and Thomas served him brilliantly, raising money, organizing campaigns, even leading troops in battle. He lived richly, dressed in fine clothes, entertained lavishly, and seemed to embrace the worldly life of a royal official. Henry trusted him completely, so much so that when the position of Archbishop of Canterbury became vacant, the most important religious position in England, Henry decided that Thomas should have it. On the surface, it seemed like a perfect plan. With his friend as archbishop, Henry believed he could control the church, bring it under royal authority, and end the conflicts that often arose between church and crown over issues like legal jurisdiction and taxation. But Henry misjudged his friend. When Thomas Becket became archbishop in 1162, something changed in him. Whether it was a genuine spiritual transformation, a sense of duty to his new role, or a recognition that he now served a higher authority than the king, Thomas became a different man. He gave up his rich lifestyle, wore simple robes, devoted himself to prayer and the care of the poor. More importantly, he began to defend the rights and privileges of the church against the king's attempts to control it. He opposed Henry on almost every issue where royal and church interests clashed. The man who had been the king's closest ally became his greatest obstacle. Henry felt betrayed. He had raised Thomas up, given him power, trusted him, and now Thomas was using that power against him. From Henry's perspective, Thomas had turned his back on their friendship, had chosen the church over loyalty to the man who had made him. But from Thomas's perspective, it was Henry who was betraying what was right, who was trying to dominate the church, who was putting earthly power above spiritual authority. Thomas believed he was serving God, that his duty as archbishop required him to resist the king, even if it meant losing the friendship he had once cherished. The conflict between them grew bitter. They argued, they negotiated, they made agreements that neither kept. At one point, Thomas fled England, living in exile in France for 6 years while the struggle continued from afar. Letters were exchanged. Intermediaries tried to make peace, but the rift only deepened. Finally, in 1170, a fragile reconciliation was arranged. Thomas returned to England, though the issues between him and Henry were not truly resolved. Thomas continued to assert the church's independence, even excommunicating some of the bishops who had sided with the king. When Henry, who was in France at the time, heard about this, he fell into a rage. In his anger, he spoke words that have been debated ever since, something along the lines of wishing someone would rid him of this troublesome priest. Whether he meant it as an order or simply as an angry outburst, 4 of his knights took it as a command. They crossed the Channel to England, rode to Canterbury, and confronted Thomas in his own cathedral. They demanded that he lift the excommunications and submit to the king. Thomas refused. He could have fled, could have hidden, but he chose to stand his ground. As evening prayers began, the knights drew their swords. In the holy space of the cathedral, they struck him down, killing him in an act of violence that horrified all of Europe. Thomas Becket died on the 29th of December, 1170, and almost immediately, he became a martyr. People began to report miracles at his tomb. The Pope canonized him as a saint just 3 years later. Henry, whether he had intended Thomas's death or not, was blamed. The whole Christian world saw him as responsible for the murder of a holy man. Henry had to do public penance, walking barefoot to Canterbury, allowing himself to be whipped by monks, kneeling at Thomas's tomb. It was a humiliation, a public acknowledgement of guilt. But the damage was done. The friendship that had once been so strong was ended in blood. Henry lived with the shadow of Thomas's death for the rest of his life, and Thomas became a symbol of the church standing against tyranny, a saint whose shrine drew pilgrims for centuries. This betrayal is different from others because it is so layered. Who betrayed whom? Did Thomas betray Henry by choosing the church over their friendship? Or did Henry betray Thomas by expecting him to put personal loyalty above his sacred duty? Perhaps both felt betrayed. Both believed the other had changed, had failed to honor what mattered most. What makes this story so powerful is that neither man was entirely wrong, nor entirely right. They were both driven by principles, by duties that conflicted, by roles that pulled them apart. Their story shows us that betrayal can happen even when both sides believe they are acting honorably, that sometimes the institutions we serve, the responsibilities we accept, can make it impossible to remain loyal to the people we love. It also shows us that the consequences of betrayal can haunt us, that some acts cannot be undone, some words cannot be taken back, and some friendships, once broken, can never be repaired. As we move forward through the Middle Ages, through times of war and plague, through the struggles of kingdoms fighting for survival, we come to one of the most tragic stories of all. A story of a young girl who saved a nation, only to be abandoned by the king she had helped, betrayed by those who should have protected her, and handed over to her enemies. This is the story of Joan of Arc, a peasant girl who heard voices she believed were from God, who led armies, who crowned a king, and who was burned at the stake before she turned 20. It is a story of faith, courage, and the cruelty of politics, a reminder that sometimes the greatest betrayals come not from enemies, but from those who benefit most from our sacrifices. France in the early 1400s was a country in despair. The 100 Years' War with England had been going on for decades, and France was losing. English armies controlled much of the northern part of the country, including Paris. The French king, Charles VI, had gone mad, and after his death, the succession was in dispute. His son, the Dauphin Charles, had a claim to the throne, but he was weak, indecisive, and had not been crowned. Many doubted he would ever truly be king. The city of Orleans was under siege, and if it fell, the English would control the heartland of France. It seemed hopeless, and then, from a small village in the east, came a girl named Joan. Joan was a farmer's daughter, illiterate, uneducated in the ways of courts and war, but she had something that no one else had in that moment. She had unshakable faith. She claimed that saints had spoken to her, Saint Michael, Saint Catherine, Saint Margaret, and that they had told her she was chosen by God to save France, to lift the siege of Orleans, and to see the Dauphin crowned at Reims, the traditional city of coronations. She convinced a local lord to take her to the Dauphin, and somehow, this teenage girl in men's clothing, speaking with absolute conviction, persuaded the uncertain prince to trust her. She was given a suit of armor, a banner, and permission to travel with the army to Orleans. What happened next seemed like a miracle. Joan's presence inspired the French soldiers, who had been defeated and demoralized for so long. She rode at the front, not wielding a sword but carrying her banner, calling on the men to fight for God and France. The siege of Orleans was lifted in just 9 days. It was a stunning victory, one that changed the course of the war. Joan became famous overnight, the Maid of Orleans, a symbol of hope. She led the army to more victories, clearing the way for the Dauphin to travel to Reims, and in July of 1429, Charles was crowned King Charles VII, with Joan standing nearby, having fulfilled the mission she believed God had given her. But after the coronation, things changed. Joan wanted to continue the fight, to push the English out of France entirely. But Charles and his advisors were cautious. They began negotiating truces, trying to find a political solution. Joan's military boldness, which had been an asset, was now seen as a problem. She was still popular with the common soldiers, still believed she was doing God's work, but the court began to see her as an inconvenience. She led a campaign against Paris, but it failed and she was wounded. Charles did not give her the support she needed. Then, in May of 1430, during a skirmish near Compiègne, Joan was captured by Burgundian soldiers, allies of the English. She was a prisoner, a valuable one, and she expected that Charles, the king she had crowned, would ransom her, would do everything possible to free her. But he did nothing. This was the betrayal. Charles VII, who owed his throne to Joan, who had seen her risk everything for him, abandoned her. He made no serious effort to negotiate her release, sent no ransom. Perhaps he was afraid of being associated with her, worried that if she was declared a heretic or a witch, it would undermine his legitimacy. Perhaps he simply saw her as no longer useful. Whatever his reasons, Joan was left to face her fate alone. The Burgundians sold her to the English, who were eager to destroy her. But they did not execute her as a prisoner of war. Instead, they turned her over to the church to be tried for heresy, for witchcraft, for the sin of wearing men's clothing, for claiming to hear voices from God. It was a show trial designed to discredit her and, by extension, to discredit Charles's claim to the throne. Joan was 19 years old, held in chains, interrogated by learned theologians who twisted her words, who tried to trap her into saying something they could use against her. She had no lawyer, no advocate, no one to speak for her. She defended herself with simple honesty, answering their questions as best she could, holding to her faith that she had done what God asked of her. But the outcome was predetermined. She was found guilty. The sentence was death by burning, the punishment for heretics. On the 30th of May, 1431, in the marketplace of Rouen, Joan of Arc was tied to a stake and burned alive. She asked for a cross, and someone held one up for her to see as the flames rose. She called out to Jesus until the smoke and fire took her voice. Her ashes were thrown into the river so that no relics could be made, so that she would be forgotten. But she was not forgotten. Within a few years, as France continued to push back the English and reclaim its territory, people began to remember Joan, to speak of her as a martyr, as a saint. Charles VII, now secure on his throne, authorized a retrial 25 years after her death. This time, the verdict was overturned. Joan was declared innocent, a victim of a corrupt trial. Centuries later, in 1920, she was canonized as a saint by the Catholic Church, recognized officially as someone who had died for her faith. But all of this came too late for Joan herself. She had been betrayed by the king she served, abandoned by the army she led, and handed over to her enemies by people who should have protected her. Her story is one of the most painful examples of how those in power will use people when it benefits them and discard them when it does not. Joan gave everything, and in return, she was left alone to face the flames. Her story has echoed through history as a symbol of courage and faith, but also as a warning about the cost of loyalty, about how institutions and leaders will betray individuals when it serves their interests. Joan believed in her mission, believed in her king, believed that she was doing God's work. And for a time, everyone was happy to let her believe that, to use her faith and her courage to win battles. But when she became inconvenient, when her presence complicated political negotiations, she was expendable. The betrayal of Joan of Arc was not a sudden knife in the back, but a slow, cold turning away, a refusal to act, a decision to let her suffer and die rather than risk anything to save her. It is a betrayal that still has the power to make us feel anger and sorrow, even 600 years later, because it reminds us of how the innocent and the faithful can be sacrificed by those who care only for their own survival. Leaving the battlefields of medieval France, we turn now to the world of espionage and intrigue, to a time when secrets could topple kingdoms and a single letter could mean the difference between life and death. This is a world of whispers, of coded messages, of people who lived double lives, presenting one face to the world while secretly serving another master. In this world, betrayal was a tool, a weapon, and sometimes the only way to survive. One of the most fascinating stories of this kind comes from the court of Queen Mary of Scotland, a queen whose life was filled with betrayal from start to finish, and whose downfall was sealed by a man who pretended to serve her while working for her enemies. This is the story of Mary, Queen of Scots, and the spies who destroyed her. Mary Stuart became Queen of Scotland when she was only 6 days old, in 1542, after her father, King James V, died. She was sent to France as a child, raised in the French court, married to the French king, and seemed destined for a life of power and luxury. But her young husband died, and Mary returned to Scotland in 1561, a Catholic queen in a country that had embraced Protestantism during her absence. From the beginning, her reign was troubled. She faced rebellion from Protestant lords, was pressured to marry again, and made a series of poor choices that weakened her position. She married her cousin, Lord Darnley, a man who turned out to be cruel and ambitious. Then Darnley was murdered in mysterious circumstances, and Mary married the Earl of Bothwell, who was widely suspected of the murder. It was too much for the Scottish lords to accept. They rose against her, forced her to abdicate in favor of her infant son, and imprisoned her. Mary escaped and fled south, across the border into England, hoping that her cousin, Queen Elizabeth I, would help her reclaim her throne. But Elizabeth faced a difficult choice. Mary was a threat. As a Catholic with a claim to the English throne, she was a rallying point for anyone who wanted to overthrow Elizabeth. Yet she was also a queen, family, someone who had come asking for help. Elizabeth did not send Mary back to Scotland, but she did not help her either. Instead, Mary became a prisoner, held in various castles and manor houses in England for the next 19 years. She lived in a kind of comfortable captivity, allowed servants, allowed to correspond, but never free. And during those 19 years, plots swirled around her. Catholic nobles in England and abroad saw her as the rightful queen, and they planned repeatedly to free her, to kill Elizabeth, to put Mary on the throne. Most of these plots were discovered and crushed, but they made Elizabeth's advisors increasingly nervous. They believed that as long as Mary lived, she was a danger. But Elizabeth hesitated to execute a fellow queen to set such a precedent. So the situation dragged on, year after year, until finally, a man named Francis Walsingham found a way to bring it to an end. Walsingham was Elizabeth's spymaster, a man who ran a network of agents across Europe, who read intercepted letters, who planted informants, who was absolutely ruthless in protecting his queen. He believed that Mary had to die, but he needed proof that she was actively involved in treason. So he set a trap. He allowed Mary to believe she had a secure way to communicate with the outside world, a way to send and receive secret letters hidden in beer barrels delivered to her residence. What Mary did not know was that every letter she sent, every letter she received, passed through Walsingham's hands. He had broken her codes, read her words, and was waiting for her to incriminate herself. And then, in 1586, a plot was proposed by a young Catholic named Anthony Babington. The plan was to assassinate Elizabeth, free Mary, and start a Catholic uprising. Letters went back and forth discussing the details, and Mary, whether out of desperation, naivety, or genuine agreement, wrote a letter that seemed to approve of the plan, or at least to acknowledge it. That was all Walsingham needed. The Babington plotters were arrested, tortured, and executed. Mary was put on trial for treason. She defended herself eloquently, arguing that she was a queen, not subject to English law, that she had been imprisoned unjustly, that she had a right to seek her freedom. But the verdict was never in doubt. She was found guilty. Elizabeth, reluctant to the end, finally signed the death warrant. On the 8th of February 1587, in the Great Hall of Fotheringhay Castle, Mary, Queen of Scots, was beheaded. She faced her death with great dignity, forgiving her executioners, praying in Latin, dying as a Catholic martyr in her own eyes and in the eyes of her supporters. The betrayal in this story is complex. Mary was betrayed by many people over her life, by the Scottish lords who turned against her, by Bothwell who used her, by Elizabeth who kept her prisoner. But the most insidious betrayal was by Walsingham and his agents, who created a situation where Mary believed she could act, could correspond, could plan, when in reality, every word she wrote was being used to build the case against her. The man who delivered her secret letters, who seemed to be helping her, was actually working for Walsingham. Her trust was weaponized against her. This kind of betrayal, where someone pretends to be an ally while secretly serving the enemy, is particularly cruel because it turns the victim's own actions into the instrument of their destruction. Mary believed she was being clever, cautious, using codes and hidden messages. She did not know that she was walking into a trap, that every step she took brought her closer to the executioner's block. Mary's story also shows the nature of political betrayal, where personal loyalty is meaningless compared to the survival of the state. Elizabeth's advisors did not hate Mary personally, but they saw her as a threat, and so they worked tirelessly to eliminate that threat. Walsingham likely felt he was doing his duty, protecting his queen and his country. From his perspective, he was not a betrayer but a patriot. Yet from Mary's perspective, and from the perspective of history, the deception, the manipulation, the false hope given to her, all constitute a profound betrayal. Mary died believing that she had been unjustly treated, that she was a victim, and in many ways she was right. She was also, undeniably, a woman who had made serious mistakes, who had poor judgment in choosing allies and husbands, who had become entangled in dangerous plots. Her execution ended the long struggle between her and Elizabeth, but it also made her a martyr, especially in Catholic Europe, and it set the stage for further conflict. Within 20 years, Mary's son, James, would inherit the throne of England after Elizabeth's death, uniting the crowns of Scotland and England, something Mary had always hoped for but never lived to see. Moving into a more modern era, we find betrayal taking on new forms, shaped by revolutions, by the creation of new nations, by wars fought not just for kings but for ideas. In this new world, loyalty to a cause could be tested by personal grievance, by ambition, by the feeling that one's sacrifices had not been recognized. One of the most infamous betrayals in American history comes from the Revolutionary War, a war fought to create a new nation free from British rule, and it involves a man who was once a hero, who risked his life repeatedly for the American cause, and who then turned his coat and tried to hand over a vital fortress to the enemy. This is the story of Benedict Arnold, a name that has become synonymous with treason in the United States, a man whose betrayal was so shocking that it has echoed through American history for more than 2 centuries. Benedict Arnold was born in Connecticut in 1741, into a family that had once been prosperous but had fallen on hard times. He became a merchant, a businessman, restless and ambitious, always looking for a way to prove himself. When the American Revolution began in 1775, Arnold was one of the first to volunteer. He was brave, almost recklessly so, and he was a natural military leader. He participated in the capture of Fort Ticonderoga, led an incredibly difficult expedition through the wilderness of Maine to attack Quebec, and fought with great skill and courage even when that attack failed. He was wounded, almost captured, but he kept fighting. In the years that followed, he distinguished himself again and again. He led the defense of Lake Champlain, building a fleet of ships and fighting a delaying action that gave the American forces time to prepare. He played a crucial role in the Battle of Saratoga in 1777, one of the most important American victories of the war, charging into battle against orders and being wounded again, this time seriously, his leg shattered by a musket ball. By all accounts, Arnold was a brilliant and fearless officer, but he was also proud, thin-skinned, and convinced that he was not receiving the recognition he deserved. He had been passed over for promotion, while men he considered less capable were advanced ahead of him. He had been accused of financial misconduct, of misusing his position for personal profit, accusations that had some basis but that also reflected the chaotic state of finances during the war. He felt that Congress and the military leadership did not appreciate him, that his sacrifices, his wounds, his victories counted for nothing. He was also in debt, having spent his own money to support his troops and to maintain his lifestyle, and he was struggling financially. In 1779, he was given command of Philadelphia, a position that was more administrative than military, and there he met and married Peggy Shippen, a young woman from a loyalist family with ties to the British. Peggy Arnold, as she became, was charming, intelligent, and ambitious. Some historians believe she played a key role in what happened next, encouraging Arnold, perhaps even initiating the contact with the British. What is certain is that by 1780, Arnold had begun a secret correspondence with the British, offering to switch sides, to provide intelligence, and eventually, to hand over a major American position. He used coded letters, pseudonyms, and go-betweens to communicate with Major John Andre, a British officer responsible for espionage. Arnold drove a hard bargain, demanding a large sum of money and a high rank in the British Army. The British were interested, very interested, because Arnold was a genuine hero of the American cause, and his defection would be a propaganda coup as well as a military advantage. Arnold maneuvered to get himself appointed commander of West Point, a fort on the Hudson River that was considered the key to controlling the Hudson Valley and the link between New England and the rest of the colonies. If the British could take West Point, they could split the American forces and potentially win the war. In September of 1780, Arnold met secretly with Major André to finalize the plan. Arnold provided detailed information about West Point's defenses, its weaknesses, the best way to attack. He agreed to weaken the garrison, to ensure that when the British attacked, the fort would fall easily. But the plot was discovered by chance. André, traveling back to British lines, was captured by American militiamen. They found the incriminating documents hidden in his boot, papers in Arnold's handwriting detailing the fort's defenses. Word was sent to General Washington, who was on his way to visit West Point. Arnold, warned just in time, fled down the river to a British ship, escaping capture by minutes. André was not so lucky. He was tried as a spy and hanged, despite British appeals for his release. Arnold, now openly a British officer, spent the rest of the war fighting for the British, leading raids against his former comrades, burning towns, and trying to convince other Americans to switch sides as he had. But his defection did not turn the tide of the war. The Americans were outraged, and Arnold's name became a byword for treachery. The betrayal of Benedict Arnold is particularly painful because he had been a genuine hero. He had bled for the American cause, had risked his life, had achieved real victories. And then he threw it all away. Why? The reasons are complex. Certainly, he felt unappreciated, passed over, unfairly accused. Certainly, he was motivated by money, by the promise of wealth and position from the British. But there also seems to have been a deep personal bitterness, a sense that if his country did not value him, then he owed it nothing. His betrayal was not sudden, but the result of accumulated grievances, of resentment festering over time, of opportunities presented and taken. It is also a reminder that betrayal can come from the people who seem most committed, most brave, because they are also the ones who may feel most entitled to recognition, most wounded when they believe they have been slighted. After the war, Arnold lived in Britain, given a military rank and a pension, but he was never fully trusted or accepted. The British had used him, but they did not respect him. He tried various business ventures, lived in Canada for a time, and died in London in 1801, largely forgotten and unhappy. His name, however, lived on in America not as a hero, which he once was, but as a traitor, the ultimate example of someone who turned against his own country. His story is taught in schools, his name used as an insult, and his betrayal remains one of the defining moments of American history. It is a story that shows how easily heroism can turn to treachery when personal grievance is allowed to overwhelm principle, and how the consequences of betrayal can last far beyond a single lifetime. As we move into the 20th century, the nature of betrayal becomes even more complex, shaped by global conflicts, by ideological struggles, by the shadowy world of espionage where truth and lies blend together until no one is certain who is really on which side. One of the most extraordinary stories of betrayal in this era comes from the Second World War, a war that was fought not just on battlefields but in secret, through codes and spies, through intelligence and deception. This is the story of Kim Philby, a man who was one of the most successful spies of the 20th century. A man who betrayed his country, his colleagues, and his friends over decades, all while appearing to be a loyal and dedicated servant of British intelligence. His story is a reminder that betrayal is not always dramatic and obvious. Sometimes it is quiet, patient, and devastatingly effective. Harold Adrian Russell Philby, known to everyone as Kim Philby, was born in British India in 1912, the son of a famous explorer and Arabist. He was educated at Cambridge University in the 1930s, a time when many young intellectuals were drawn to communism, seeing it as the answer to the failures of capitalism and the rise of fascism. Philby was recruited by Soviet intelligence while he was still a student, and he dedicated his life to serving the Soviet Union, even as he built a career in British intelligence. He was not a spy out of necessity or coercion. He was a true believer, convinced that the Soviet Union represented the future, and that Western democracies were corrupt and doomed. He saw himself not as a traitor, but as someone serving a higher cause, working for the eventual triumph of communism around the world. During the Second World War, Philby worked for the British Secret Intelligence Service, commonly known as MI6. He was good at his job, trusted, respected, and given increasingly important responsibilities. After the war, as the Cold War began, he rose through the ranks, eventually becoming the liaison between British intelligence and the CIA in Washington, a position that gave him access to some of the most sensitive secrets of both the British and American governments. And all the while, he was passing information to the Soviets. He told them about British and American operations, about spies being sent into Soviet territory, about plans and strategies. Because of Philby's betrayal, dozens of operations failed, and many agents were captured and executed. He was responsible for the deaths of people who trusted their own governments to protect them, people who never knew that one of the most senior officers in British intelligence was working for the other side. Philby was part of a group known as the Cambridge Five, a spy ring recruited from Cambridge University in the 30s, which also included Guy Burgess, Donald Maclean, Anthony Blunt, and John Cairncross. They all worked in sensitive positions in the British government and all passed secrets to the Soviets. In 1951, Burgess and Maclean, both under suspicion, defected to the Soviet Union. Philby came under suspicion as well, especially because Burgess had been staying at his house in Washington just before the defection. Philby was interrogated, resigned from MI6, and was publicly named in Parliament as a suspected spy. But he denied it convincingly, and there was no hard proof. For several years, he lived under a cloud, working as a journalist in the Middle East, but he managed to rehabilitate himself. In 1956, he was even publicly cleared by the British government. He was brought back into MI6 unofficially, working in Beirut as a correspondent but also gathering intelligence. But suspicions never entirely went away, and by 1963, new evidence had emerged. A Soviet defector provided information that pointed to Philby. British intelligence sent a colleague, an old friend, to confront him in Beirut, to offer him immunity if he confessed. Philby made a partial confession, admitting to some past activities but downplaying their significance. But he knew the game was up. In January of 1963, he boarded a Soviet freighter in Beirut and defected to the Soviet Union, disappearing behind the Iron Curtain. The British government was humiliated. One of their most senior intelligence officers had been a Soviet spy for 3 decades. The damage to British and American intelligence was immense. The betrayal was not just of secrets, but of trust, of the belief that the people working to protect national security were loyal. Philby lived the rest of his life in Moscow, given a comfortable apartment, a pension, and the rank of colonel in the KGB. He was hailed as a hero of the Soviet Union, though his life there was reportedly not entirely happy. He had left behind family, friends, a culture he knew. He drank heavily, married several times, and lived as a kind of relic, trotted out occasionally for propaganda purposes. He wrote his memoirs, justifying his actions, insisting he had done the right thing. He never expressed remorse for the people who died because of the information he provided. He died in Moscow in 1988, just before the Soviet Union itself began to collapse, just before the communist system he had devoted his life to serving fell apart. His funeral was attended by Soviet officials, and he was buried with honors, a hero to them, a traitor to the West. The betrayal of Kim Philby is chilling because of its scale and its duration. He was not caught in a moment of weakness, not blackmailed or coerced. He chose his path when he was young, and he followed it consistently for his entire adult life. He looked his colleagues in the eye, worked alongside them, drank with them, and all the while he was betraying them. He sent men to their deaths without hesitation, because to him, they were enemies, casualties of the larger struggle he believed in. His story raises uncomfortable questions about ideology, about whether belief in a cause can justify any action, about the nature of loyalty and to whom or what we owe it. It also shows how betrayal, when it is patient and careful, can succeed for years or even decades, causing damage that is only understood much later. Philby's legacy is one of mistrust. After his exposure, British and American intelligence services went through years of paranoia, suspecting everyone, fearful that there were more Philbys hidden within their ranks. The betrayal of trust within the intelligence community took decades to heal, and in some ways it never entirely did. As we move toward the latter part of the 20th century, betrayal takes on yet another form, one that unfolds not on battlefields or in spy networks, but in the corridors of power, in political offices, and in the press. This is the story of betrayal within government, of a leader brought down not by an enemy army but by the actions of people within his own administration, by the gradual unraveling of secrets, and by a political scandal that would change the American presidency forever. This is the story of Richard Nixon and Watergate, a tale of lies, cover-ups, and the ultimate betrayal of public trust. Richard Nixon became President of the United States in 1969, after a long political career that had seen him serve as Vice President under Eisenhower, lose a close presidential race to John F. Kennedy in 1960, and then fight his way back to win the presidency 8 years later. He was a complex man, intelligent, hardworking, deeply insecure, and convinced that his enemies, the press, the liberals, the establishment, were out to destroy him. He achieved significant successes as president, opening relations with China, pursuing détente with the Soviet Union, winding down the Vietnam War, though that last was painful and controversial. But he was also consumed by a sense of siege, by a belief that he had to fight dirty because everyone else was. This mindset led him and his administration into a series of actions that would ultimately destroy his presidency. In June of 1972, during Nixon's re-election campaign, 5 men were arrested for breaking into the offices of the Democratic National Committee at the Watergate office complex in Washington. They were caught planting listening devices, stealing documents, engaged in political espionage. At first, it seemed like a minor story, a third-rate burglary as Nixon's press secretary called it. But 2 reporters at the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, began to dig deeper. They found connections between the burglars and Nixon's re-election committee, then connections to the White House itself. Nixon won re-election in a landslide in November of 1972, but the story did not go away. Investigations began by the FBI, by a special Senate committee, by a special prosecutor appointed by the Justice Department. And slowly, piece by piece, the cover-up began to unravel. The betrayals in the Watergate scandal were many and layered. First, there was the betrayal of the democratic process itself, the use of illegal tactics to spy on political opponents, to undermine elections. Then there was the cover-up, the lies told by the president and his aides to hide their involvement, the obstruction of justice, the use of executive power to try to shut down investigations. Nixon claimed he knew nothing about the break-in, that he was not involved in any cover-up. But tapes existed. Nixon had installed a secret recording system in the Oval Office, and those tapes captured his conversations, including ones where he discussed how to limit the investigation, how to use the CIA to block the FBI, how to pay hush money to the burglars to keep them quiet. When the existence of the tapes became public, a legal battle ensued. Nixon refused to hand them over, claiming executive privilege. The case went to the Supreme Court, which ruled unanimously that he had to release them. One of the most significant betrayals in the Watergate story was the role of John Dean, Nixon's White House counsel, a young lawyer who had been deeply involved in the cover-up. In April of 1973, as the investigation closed in, Dean realized that he was being set up to take the fall, that Nixon and his top aides, H.R. Haldeman and John Ehrlichman, were planning to blame him for everything. Dean decided to cooperate with prosecutors. He testified before the Senate Watergate Committee in June of 1973 in televised hearings that riveted the nation. He described in detail the cover-up, the meetings in the Oval Office, the president's involvement. It was Dean's testimony that transformed Watergate from a scandal about campaign dirty tricks into a constitutional crisis about whether the president had committed crimes. From Nixon's perspective, Dean's testimony was the ultimate betrayal, a trusted aide turning against him, revealing secrets, destroying the carefully constructed lies. From Dean's perspective, he was saving himself, refusing to be the scapegoat, telling the truth after being asked to lie and cover up for too long. The tapes, when they were finally released, confirmed much of what Dean had said. They revealed a president who was profane, paranoid, and willing to obstruct justice to protect himself and his aides. One tape from June 23, 1972, just days after the break-in, became known as the smoking gun. It captured Nixon agreeing to use the CIA to stop the FBI investigation, a clear act of obstruction. When this tape was made public in August of 1974, Nixon's remaining support in Congress collapsed. Republicans who had defended him told him he would be impeached by the House and convicted by the Senate. Facing certain removal from office, Nixon resigned on August 8, 1974, the first and only American president ever to resign. He left the White House the next day, flying to California, a disgraced and broken man. His vice president, Gerald Ford, became president and a month later granted Nixon a full pardon, sparing him from criminal prosecution but sealing his legacy as a president who had betrayed the public trust. The Watergate scandal was a betrayal on multiple levels. Nixon betrayed the American people by lying to them, by using the powers of his office for illegal purposes, by putting his own survival above the law. His aides betrayed their oaths, participating in crimes and cover-ups. And then, when it all fell apart, they betrayed each other, testifying against one another, trying to save themselves. The whole episode revealed the dark side of political ambition, the way that loyalty to a leader can lead people to commit crimes, and the way that when the pressure becomes too great, that loyalty shatters and everyone scrambles to escape the wreckage. Watergate changed American politics. It led to reforms in campaign finance, to greater skepticism of presidential power, to a generation of journalists inspired by Woodward and Bernstein's investigative reporting. It also left a legacy of cynicism, a belief that politicians are corrupt, that they will lie and cheat, that power corrupts absolutely. Nixon lived for 20 years after his resignation, working to rehabilitate his reputation, writing books, advising on foreign policy, slowly gaining some respect as an elder statesman. But he could never escape Watergate. It defined him. When he died in 1994, the obituaries all led with his resignation, with the scandal that forced him from office. His story is a reminder that betrayal of public trust, betrayal of the laws and principles that hold a democracy together, has consequences, that no one is above accountability, and that sometimes the greatest betrayals are not of individuals but of the institutions and ideals that bind a society. There is a particular kind of betrayal that cuts deeper than most, and that is the betrayal between friends who fought together, who risked their lives side by side, who built something together and then saw it torn apart by ambition, by ideology, by the cruel twists of history. In the 20th century, as nations threw off colonial rule and sought to define themselves, this kind of betrayal happened again and again, as revolutionary comrades who had fought for freedom turned on each other in struggles for power. One of the most tragic examples comes from Cuba, from the story of two men who led a revolution together, who transformed their island nation, but whose relationship ended in mutual suspicion, exile, and death. This is the story of Fidel Castro and Huber Matos, though it could just as easily be the story of Castro and many others who began as allies and ended as enemies. Fidel Castro became the face of the Cuban Revolution, the bearded guerrilla leader who overthrew the dictator Fulgencio Batista in January 1959 and reshaped Cuba according to his vision. But he did not do it alone. He had many comrades, men and women who believed in the cause, who fought in the mountains, who risked everything for the dream of a free Cuba. One of those men was Huber Matos, a schoolteacher who became a military commander, leading troops in the final campaigns of the revolution. Matos was a patriot, a democrat, someone who believed in the ideals of freedom and justice that the revolution proclaimed. But as the months passed after the victory, Matos became increasingly troubled by the direction Castro was taking. The revolution was becoming radicalized, moving toward communism, aligning with the Soviet Union, suppressing dissent. This was not what Matos had fought for. He believed in democracy, in free elections, in a Cuba that was independent, not tied to either the United States or the Soviet Union. In October of 1959, less than a year after the revolution's triumph, Matos wrote a letter to Castro, resigning his military command. In the letter, he expressed his concerns about the communist influence in the government, about the suppression of freedom. He was careful, respectful, but firm. He wanted to leave, to step away, to return to his life as a teacher. Castro's response was swift and harsh. He accused Matos of betrayal, of treason, of trying to undermine the revolution. Castro flew to the city where Matos was based, arrested him personally, and had him put on trial. The trial was a spectacle, a show designed to send a message. Matos was convicted and sentenced to 20 years in prison, charged with sedition and treason. He spent 2 decades in harsh conditions, in solitary confinement, enduring physical and psychological abuse, never wavering in his belief that he had done the right thing. From Castro's perspective, Matos had betrayed the revolution at a critical moment, when Cuba was under threat from the United States, when unity was essential. He saw Matos's resignation and his criticism as giving comfort to the enemy, as undermining the collective struggle. From Matos's perspective, it was Castro who had betrayed the revolution, who had turned it into a dictatorship, who had replaced one tyranny with another. Both men believed they were defending Cuba, defending the ideals they had fought for, but their visions of what Cuba should be were incompatible. Matos wanted democracy and independence. Castro wanted revolution and loyalty, a unified front against imperialism, and he would tolerate no dissent. This pattern repeated itself throughout Castro's long rule. Many of the men and women who had fought beside him in the mountains, who had been his comrades, eventually fell out of favor, were purged, imprisoned, executed, or forced into exile. Some were accused of being spies, others of being traitors, others simply of disagreeing with Castro's policies. The revolution, which had promised freedom, became a system where loyalty to Castro was the highest virtue, and questioning him was the greatest sin. The betrayals went both ways. Castro felt betrayed by those who did not share his total commitment, who wanted something different than the path he had chosen. And those who left or were cast out felt betrayed by what the revolution had become, by the fact that the freedom they had fought for had never arrived. Huber Matos was released from prison in 1979 after serving his full 20-year sentence. He went into exile in the United States, where he continued to speak out against Castro's regime, to advocate for democracy in Cuba. He wrote his memoirs, telling his side of the story, describing his time in prison, and reaffirming his belief that he had been right to speak up, even though it cost him his freedom. He lived to see the end of the Cold War, the collapse of the Soviet Union, the gradual changes in Cuba. Castro, meanwhile, ruled Cuba for nearly 5 decades, becoming one of the longest-serving leaders in the world, a symbol of resistance to some, a dictator to others. He died in 2016, and power passed to his brother Raul, keeping the revolution in the family. Matos died in 2021, still in exile, never having returned to live in the Cuba he had fought to free. The story of Castro and Matos, and the many others like it, reminds us that revolutions often devour their own children, that the unity forged in struggle can shatter when the struggle ends and the hard work of building something new begins. It shows us that people who fight together for a common cause can have very different visions of what victory looks like, and that when those visions clash, the result is often betrayal, as each side accuses the other of abandoning the principles they once shared. It is a story about the difficulty of translating ideals into reality, about how power can corrupt, and about how the personal bonds of friendship and comradeship can be destroyed by politics, by ideology, by the unforgiving demands of leadership. In the end, both men believed they were serving Cuba, defending what they had fought for. But they could not both be right, and so one became the ruler and the other became the prisoner, one a legend and the other a footnote, each convinced that the other was the betrayer. There are betrayals that happen on the grand stage of history, involving presidents and generals, spies and revolutionaries. And then there are betrayals that are deeply personal, that happen within families, within communities, where the bonds of blood and shared experience are broken in ways that are almost unbearable to contemplate. One such story comes from the civil rights movement in the United States, a movement that sought to end racial segregation and discrimination, a struggle that required immense courage, sacrifice, and trust. Within that movement, there were informants, people who pretended to be committed to the cause but who were actually working for the FBI, providing information that was used to undermine, discredit, and destroy the very people they claimed to support. This is a story not about a single betrayal, but about a pattern of betrayal, and the way institutions used fear and manipulation to turn people against each other. During the 1950s and 1960s, as the civil rights movement grew in strength, as African Americans and their allies marched, protested, organized, and demanded justice, the FBI, under the leadership of J. Edgar Hoover, saw the movement as a threat. Hoover believed that civil rights leaders, particularly Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., were influenced by communists, were dangerous radicals who could destabilize the country. He launched a secret program called COINTELPRO, short for Counterintelligence Program, designed to infiltrate, disrupt, and neutralize groups that he saw as subversive. This included not just the Communist Party but also civil rights organizations, black nationalist groups, anti-war activists, and others. The methods used were often illegal, involving wiretaps, burglaries, planting false information, and recruiting informants. Informants were people within the movement who agreed, sometimes willingly, sometimes under pressure, to provide information to the FBI. Some were motivated by money. Some were coerced, threatened with exposure of past crimes or personal secrets. Some genuinely believed they were helping to prevent violence or extremism, though often they were simply tools used by the FBI to sow distrust and fear. These informants attended meetings, reported on plans, identified leaders, and sometimes actively worked to disrupt activities, to create conflicts, to push groups toward more radical actions that would justify crackdowns. The people in the movement had no way of knowing who was an informant, who could be trusted. It created an atmosphere of paranoia, where everyone was suspect, where friendships were strained, where the movement had to expend energy watching for betrayers within rather than focusing entirely on the struggle for justice. One of the most painful examples involved the Black Panther Party, a revolutionary black nationalist organization founded in 1966 that advocated armed self-defense and community programs. The FBI saw the Panthers as a major threat and infiltrated them extensively. Informants rose to positions of leadership within the party, influencing decisions, sometimes encouraging violence. In December of 1969, the Chicago police, working with the FBI, raided an apartment where Fred Hampton, a charismatic young leader of the Chicago Panthers, was sleeping. They shot him dead in his bed, along with another Panther, Mark Clark. It later came out that an FBI informant, William O'Neill, who was Hampton's head of security, had provided the floor plan of the apartment, had drugged Hampton the night before to make sure he would not wake up, had done everything possible to ensure the raid would succeed. O'Neill had been recruited by the FBI years earlier, paid regularly, and given the mission to infiltrate and undermine the Panthers. He succeeded beyond what anyone might have imagined, facilitating the murder of one of the movement's brightest leaders. The betrayal here is almost beyond words. Hampton trusted O'Neill, relied on him, saw him as a brother in the struggle. And O'Neill was working for the people who wanted to destroy them. After the raid, after Hampton's death, O'Neill continued to work for the FBI for a time, then eventually faded into obscurity. Years later, in interviews, he expressed some regret, some sense of the weight of what he had done, but he also tried to justify it, saying he was just doing a job, following orders. In 1990, he died, possibly by suicide, running into traffic on a highway, as if he could not live with himself any longer. His betrayal had helped to kill a man who might have become a major leader, who might have changed history, and it left a scar on the movement that never fully healed. The broader pattern of FBI informants and COINTELPRO operations was not fully revealed until the 1970s, when documents were stolen from an FBI office and leaked to the press, and later when congressional investigations brought some of the activities to light. The revelations were shocking, showing the extent to which the government had gone to undermine lawful political activity, to disrupt movements that were seeking change through legal means. The use of informants, the sowing of distrust, the manipulation and the lies, all of it was a betrayal of the democratic principles the government was supposed to uphold. It showed that the state itself could be a betrayer, using its power not to protect citizens but to control them, to suppress dissent, to maintain the status quo. For the people who lived through this, who were part of the movements that were targeted, the knowledge that there were informants among them, that someone they trusted might have been reporting on them, was deeply traumatizing. It made organizing harder, made trust fragile, and left lasting damage. Even today, activists and organizers are wary, knowing that history has shown that infiltration and betrayal are real threats. The legacy of COINTELPRO and of informants like William O'Neill is a reminder that betrayal can be systematic, that it can be policy, and that sometimes the greatest betrayers are not individuals acting alone but institutions using individuals as weapons against their own people. In the world of organized crime, betrayal is a constant reality, almost an occupational hazard. Loyalty is preached as the highest value. The code of silence, omerta, is sacred, and yet betrayal happens again and again, as people turn informant to save themselves, to avoid prison, to escape death. The story of the mafia in America is full of such betrayals, but one stands out for its drama, its consequences, and the insight it gives into a world where trust is everything and yet means nothing. This is the story of Sammy the Bull Gravano, the underboss of the Gambino crime family, who turned against his boss, John Gotti, and in doing so, helped to bring down one of the most powerful and famous mobsters in American history. John Gotti became the head of the Gambino family in 1985, after orchestrating the murder of the previous boss, Paul Castellano. Gotti was flashy, charismatic, always dressed in expensive suits, loved by the tabloids, who called him the Dapper Don and the Teflon Don because he had been tried multiple times and always acquitted. He seemed untouchable, a throwback to the old days of organized crime, when bosses were public figures, celebrities in their own right. By his side was Sammy Gravano, a tough, ruthless man who had risen through the ranks by being a top earner and a reliable killer. Gravano was the underboss, the second in command, and he was fiercely loyal to Gotti, or so it seemed. Together, they ran a criminal empire involved in extortion, loan sharking, illegal gambling, murder, and numerous other crimes. They made millions of dollars, lived lavishly, and believed that they were above the law. But the FBI was watching, listening. They had bugged the apartment above a social club where Gotti and his associates met. They recorded hours of conversations, incriminating discussions about crimes, about murders, about the operations of the family. In 1990, Gotti, Gravano, and several others were indicted on multiple charges, including murder and racketeering. This time, the FBI had the evidence they needed, the tapes that would prove Gotti's involvement in the very crimes he had always denied. But they also had a plan to turn Gravano, to get him to testify, because testimony from an insider, from the underboss himself, would be devastating, would guarantee a conviction. At first, Gravano seemed solid, ready to go to trial, to stand with Gotti. But then he heard some of the tapes, the ones where Gotti talked about him, complained about him, blamed him for various problems. Gravano realized that Gotti was positioning to throw him under the bus, to claim that Gravano was the one responsible for the murders, that Gotti was just a figurehead who knew nothing. The betrayal Gravano felt was profound. He had killed for Gotti, had risked his life, had been loyal, and now Gotti was going to sacrifice him to save himself. Faced with that realization, and facing the prospect of life in prison, Gravano made a decision. He agreed to cooperate with the government, to testify against Gotti and others, to break the code of omerta that had been drilled into him since he was young. Gravano's testimony in 1992 was a sensation. Here was a high-ranking mobster, someone who admitted to participating in 19 murders, sitting on the witness stand in a courtroom, calmly describing the inner workings of the mafia, confirming what the tapes showed, and directly implicating John Gotti. It was unprecedented. Mobsters did not testify against their bosses, did not break the code. But Gravano did, in detail, over days of testimony. The jury believed him. Gotti was convicted on all charges and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He died in prison in 2002, still insisting he had done nothing wrong, still angry at Gravano for betraying him. Gravano, for his part, entered the witness protection program, served a reduced sentence of 5 years, and was released, given a new identity, a new life, all in exchange for his cooperation. But the story does not end there. Gravano could not stay out of trouble. In the early 2000s, he was arrested again, this time for running a large ecstasy drug ring in Arizona. The quiet life of witness protection had not been enough for him. He was convicted and served another prison sentence, getting out in 2017. Today, he lives openly, has a podcast, gives interviews, talks about his life in the mafia as if it were a career like any other. Some people are fascinated by him, by his stories, by his willingness to talk about things that were once secret. Others see him as the ultimate traitor, someone who broke every rule, who caused the downfall of his friends, and who profited from his betrayal. The betrayal of Sammy Gravano is complicated because, in many ways, he was betrayed first. Gotti was willing to sacrifice him, and Gravano responded by saving himself, by doing what so many mobsters do when faced with serious prison time, turning informant. In the mafia, loyalty is supposed to be absolute, but the reality is that when people face the rest of their lives behind bars, loyalty often crumbles. Gravano's decision to testify destroyed the Gambino family's leadership, led to numerous other prosecutions, and changed the landscape of organized crime in New York. It also showed that the code of silence, so feared and so revered, could be broken, that even the toughest, most committed mobsters would betray each other when the pressure was great enough. Gotti saw himself as betrayed by his underboss, by the man he had trusted. Gravano saw himself as reacting to Gotti's betrayal, as doing what he had to do to survive. Both were probably right, which is a reminder that in a world built on crime and violence, betrayal is not an aberration but an inherent part of the structure, a predictable outcome when the only real rule is self-preservation. Chapter 13: The Scientist's Secret. As we move deeper into the modern world, betrayal takes on forms shaped by technology, by science, by the immense power that knowledge brings. In the 20th century, scientists unlocked the secrets of the atom, creating weapons of unimaginable destruction. The development of nuclear weapons was one of the greatest scientific achievements and one of the most dangerous, and it was also a field ripe for betrayal, for the stealing of secrets, for the passing of knowledge to rival nations. One of the most significant cases of scientific betrayal in history involves Klaus Fuchs, a physicist who worked on the Manhattan Project, the secret American program to build the atomic bomb during World War II, and who passed crucial information to the Soviet Union, helping them to develop their own bomb years earlier than they would have otherwise. Klaus Fuchs was born in Germany in 1911, into a family with strong political convictions. His father was a Lutheran pastor and a socialist, and Klaus grew up in an environment where standing up for one's beliefs was important. When the Nazis came to power in Germany in the 1930s, Fuchs, who was a communist, fled the country, eventually ending up in Britain. He earned a doctorate in physics and became involved in British research on nuclear fission, the process that would lead to the atomic bomb. When Britain and the United States began collaborating on the bomb project, Fuchs was sent to America to work at Los Alamos, the secret laboratory in New Mexico where the bomb was being designed and built. He was brilliant, dedicated, and trusted, but he was also a spy. Fuchs had made contact with Soviet intelligence before he even went to America. He believed that the Soviet Union, as a communist nation and a key ally in the fight against Nazi Germany, should have access to the same technology as the West, that it was wrong for one nation to have a monopoly on such a powerful weapon. He was an ideological spy, driven not by money or coercion, but by his political beliefs. At Los Alamos, he worked on some of the most sensitive aspects of the bomb's design, including the implosion method used for the plutonium bomb. He had access to detailed information about how the bomb worked, the materials used, the calculations, the problems that had been solved. And he passed all of this to his Soviet handler, meeting secretly, handing over documents and explanations. The information he provided was enormously valuable, giving Soviet scientists a roadmap, allowing them to avoid mistakes to accelerate their own program. The United States successfully tested the first atomic bomb in July 1945, and then used 2 bombs against Japan in August, bringing World War II to an end. The atomic bomb gave the United States an overwhelming military advantage, a deterrent that seemed to guarantee American dominance in the post-war world. But that advantage did not last as long as American leaders expected. In August 1949, the Soviet Union tested its own atomic bomb, stunning the West. How had they done it so quickly? The answer, though it took time to discover, was espionage, and Klaus Fuchs was one of the most important sources. After the war, Fuchs returned to Britain and continued his work, now at the British Nuclear Research Facility at Harwell. He kept passing information to the Soviets, though by this time, the initial urgency had passed. In 1949, American and British intelligence, through a combination of code-breaking and investigation, began to close in on a Soviet spy within the nuclear program. Suspicion fell on Fuchs. He was interrogated, and eventually, in January 1950, he confessed. He admitted that he had passed secrets to the Soviets, explained his reasoning, expressed no regret for his actions. He was tried for espionage under British law, convicted, and sentenced to 14 years in prison, the maximum sentence at the time. He served 9 years and was then released, moving to East Germany, where he continued to work as a scientist, living quietly until his death in 1988. He was never remorseful. He believed he had done the right thing, that he had helped to balance power, to prevent the United States from having a monopoly on nuclear weapons that could lead to aggression or blackmail. The betrayal of Klaus Fuchs is particularly significant because of its consequences. The information he provided helped the Soviet Union to develop their bomb years earlier than they might have otherwise, which meant that the period of American nuclear monopoly was much shorter, which changed the dynamics of the Cold War, which led to the arms race, to the stockpiling of thousands of nuclear weapons by both sides, to decades of living under the threat of mutually assured destruction. Fuchs's actions, driven by his ideology, had global consequences that affected millions of people who never knew his name. From the perspective of the United States and Britain, Fuchs was a traitor who had betrayed the countries that had given him refuge, that had trusted him with their most important secrets. From his own perspective, he was being true to his principles, acting according to his conscience, doing what he believed would make the world safer by preventing one nation from having too much power. This case also illustrates a broader point about scientific knowledge and the ethics of secrecy. Scientists often believe that knowledge should be shared, that scientific discoveries belong to humanity, not to one nation. Yet in the realm of weapons, of military technology, governments demand secrecy, demand loyalty, demand that scientists work for national interests even when those might conflict with broader human interests. Fuchs was caught between these two values, and he chose to follow his own political and ethical beliefs rather than the oaths he had taken. His betrayal raises questions that are still relevant today about the responsibility of scientists, about the ownership of knowledge, about whether loyalty to an ideology or to humanity can ever justify betraying a trust, stealing secrets, and contributing to an arms race that brought the world to the brink of annihilation. In more recent decades, as the world has become more interconnected, as media has grown in power and influence, betrayal has taken on new dimensions, involving leaks, investigations, and the exposure of wrongdoing at the highest levels. One of the most dramatic and public betrayals in the business world involved a media empire, a powerful mogul, and a close friend who turned into a key witness against him. This is the story of Conrad Black and his associate David Radler, a tale of corporate fraud, ambition, and the collapse of trust that led to prison and disgrace. Conrad Black was a Canadian-born businessman who built a global newspaper empire, Hollinger International, which at its height owned hundreds of newspapers, including the Daily Telegraph in London and the Chicago Sun-Times. Black was not just a businessman. He was an intellectual, an author, a member of the British House of Lords, a man who moved in the highest circles of politics and society. He was also ruthless, ambitious, and, as it turned out, willing to bend or break the rules to enrich himself. For years, Black and his top executives, including his longtime friend and partner David Radler, used their control of Hollinger to pay themselves enormous sums of money through a scheme involving non-compete agreements. These were agreements that, on paper, were payments to Black and others to not compete with the company after selling certain newspapers, but in reality they were a way to funnel money out of the company into their own pockets, money that should have gone to shareholders. For years, the scheme went unnoticed or at least unchallenged. But in the early 2000s, a special committee of the board of directors began investigating irregularities. They discovered that Black and Radler had taken hundreds of millions of dollars in payments that had not been properly approved, that had not been disclosed to shareholders, and that appeared to be fraudulent. The scandal became public. Black was forced out as CEO. Lawsuits were filed. And then the criminal investigation began. The U.S. Attorney's Office in Chicago brought charges of fraud and obstruction of justice against Black, Radler, and several others. The case was complex, involving accounting, corporate governance, and the question of whether Black and his associates had intentionally deceived shareholders and the board. David Radler, who had been Black's right-hand man, his partner in building the empire, faced serious charges and a long prison sentence if convicted. He decided to cooperate with prosecutors. In a plea deal, he agreed to testify against Black, to admit his own role in the fraud, and to provide evidence about how the scheme worked and how Black was involved. For Black, this was the ultimate betrayal. Radler was not just a business associate. He was a friend of decades, someone Black had trusted completely, someone who knew all the details of their business dealings. And now Radler was sitting on a witness stand, calmly explaining to a jury how they had defrauded their own company, how they had taken money that did not belong to them, how Black had been the driving force behind it all. Black's trial in 2007 was a media spectacle. Here was a man who had once owned newspapers, who had shaped public opinion, now being torn apart in the press he had once controlled. Black maintained his innocence, argued that he had done nothing illegal, that the payments were proper, that he was being persecuted by enemies who wanted to bring him down. But the jury believed Raidler and the documentary evidence. Black was convicted on 3 counts of fraud and 1 count of obstruction of justice. He was sentenced to 6.5 years in federal prison. He served more than 3 years before being released, his convictions partially overturned on appeal, though the fraud conviction stood. He lost his fortune, his reputation, his position in society. Raidler, meanwhile, served 29 months in prison, a relatively light sentence in exchange for his cooperation, and then disappeared from public life. The Betrayal of Conrad Black by David Raidler is a story about what happens when the stakes are high enough, when people face the prospect of losing everything, of spending years behind bars. Raidler chose to save himself, to cut a deal, to testify, even though it meant turning on a man he had worked with for decades. From Black's perspective, it was treachery of the worst kind, a friend putting his own interests above loyalty. From Raidler's perspective, Black had put them both in a position where cooperation was the only rational choice, and why should Raidler sacrifice himself for someone who had been equally involved in the wrongdoing? The case also illustrates how betrayal functions in the corporate world, where loyalty is often situational, where people will turn on each other when their interests diverge, and where the bonds of friendship and partnership can dissolve under the pressure of legal jeopardy. Black has written about his experience, published a memoir, tried to rebuild his life and reputation. He received a pardon from President Trump in 2019, which did not change his conviction but was a symbolic gesture. He remains a controversial figure, seen by some as a victim of an overzealous prosecution, by others as a man who got what he deserved. Raidler's testimony was crucial to the conviction, and without it, Black might have been acquitted or received a lesser sentence. The story reminds us that in the modern world, betrayal often happens in courtrooms, through plea deals and immunity agreements, where the state uses the threat of punishment to turn people against each other, to break apart criminal conspiracies or corporate fraud schemes by making it more attractive to cooperate than to stay silent. As we move into the 21st century, into the digital age, betrayal takes on new forms shaped by technology, by the ability to copy and transmit vast amounts of information instantly, by the tension between secrecy and transparency, between national security and the public's right to know. One of the most significant and controversial betrayals of recent times involves a young computer specialist who worked for the United States government, who had access to some of the nation's most closely guarded secrets, and who decided to leak them to the world. This is the story of Edward Snowden, a man who is seen by some as a hero, a whistleblower who exposed government overreach, and by others as a traitor who damaged national security and betrayed his country. His story is still unfolding, and the debate over whether what he did was betrayal or bravery continues. Edward Snowden was born in North Carolina in 1983, grew up during the rise of the Internet, and became deeply skilled in computer systems and networks. He worked for the CIA and then as a contractor for the National Security Agency, the NSA, the American government's massive signals intelligence organization. In these roles, he had access to classified information about the NSA's surveillance programs that collected vast amounts of data on phone calls, emails, internet activity, not just of foreign targets, but of American citizens and people around the world. Snowden became increasingly troubled by what he saw. He believed that the government was violating the privacy rights of millions of people, that the surveillance was unconstitutional, that it was being done in secret without proper oversight or public debate. He felt that someone needed to expose what was happening, and he decided that he would be that person. In the spring of 2013, Snowden copied a huge number of classified documents, tens of thousands of files, detailing the NSA's programs, the technologies they used, the legal justifications they relied on, and the extent of their reach. He then left his job, flew to Hong Kong, and contacted journalists, Glenn Greenwald and others, providing them with the documents and asking them to publish stories based on the information. Over the following months, a series of explosive stories appeared, revealing programs like Prism, which collected data from internet companies, and the bulk collection of phone metadata on millions of Americans. The revelations shocked the world, sparked debates about privacy and security, led to lawsuits, congressional hearings, and changes in some of the programs. Snowden became the most famous whistleblower in the world. But the U.S. government saw it very differently. They charged Snowden with theft of government property, unauthorized communication of national defense information, and willful communication of classified intelligence to an unauthorized person, charges that carried the possibility of decades in prison. They revoked his passport while he was in transit through Moscow, and he ended up stuck in Russia, where he was eventually granted asylum. He has lived there ever since, unable to return to the United States without facing arrest and trial. American officials, including President Obama and later President Trump, have called him a traitor, argued that his leaks damaged national security, endangered intelligence sources and methods, and aided America's enemies. They say he should have used official channels to raise his concerns, that he took an oath to protect classified information, and that he violated that oath. Snowden and his supporters argue that the official channels were not an option, that the programs he exposed were so secret that there was no way to challenge them from within, that going public was the only way to spark the debate that needed to happen. They argue that what he did was not betrayal but an act of conscience, that he gave up his comfortable life, his career, his freedom, in order to inform the public about what their government was doing in their name. The debate over Snowden has become a kind of Rorschach test, where people's views reflect their broader beliefs about government, privacy, security, and the balance between them. Is it betrayal to reveal your government's secrets if you believe those secrets involve wrongdoing? Is loyalty to one's country the same as loyalty to the government, or can they be different, even opposed? What makes Snowden's case particularly complex is the scale and the nature of what he revealed. He did not just expose one program or one abuse. He released a vast trove of documents, some of which revealed legitimate intelligence activities against foreign targets, some of which exposed surveillance of American citizens, and some of which detailed intelligence cooperation with allied nations, causing diplomatic embarrassment and strain. The consequences of his actions are still being debated. Did he make the world safer by forcing a conversation about surveillance, or did he make it less safe by revealing capabilities and methods? Did he betray his country, or did he serve a higher loyalty to the principles of freedom and privacy? There are no easy answers, and people of good faith disagree passionately. Snowden has written a book, given interviews, spoken via video linked to audiences around the world, always maintaining that he did the right thing, that he has no regrets, that he would do it again. He has become a symbol used by privacy advocates, by critics of government overreach, by those who believe that transparency is more important than secrecy. But he remains in exile, unable to come home, living in a country that is itself not known for respecting privacy or freedom, a fact that his critics often point out. His story is a modern tale of betrayal and belief, of a man who decided that his obligation to the public, to the truth as he saw it, was greater than his obligation to keep his government's secrets, and who has paid a price for that decision, living far from home, uncertain if he will ever return. Whether history will remember him as a traitor or a hero remains to be seen, but his name has become part of the conversation about secrecy, surveillance, and where the line is between protecting security and preserving freedom. As we reach the end of this long journey through stories of betrayal across the centuries, across continents, across the different spheres of human life, it is worth reflecting on what these stories tell us, not just about the individuals involved, but about the human experience itself. Betrayal, in all its forms, is a fundamental part of our story as a species. It is a shadow that follows trust, a risk that comes with every bond we form, every oath we take, every secret we share. From the kiss in the garden 2,000 years ago to the digital leaks of the 21st century, the pattern remains recognizable. Someone places their trust in another, and that trust is broken, and the consequences ripple outward, sometimes touching only a few lives, sometimes reshaping the world. What have we learned from these stories? Perhaps first, that betrayal is rarely simple. It is easy to think of betrayers as purely evil, as villains who act out of malice or greed. And sometimes that is true. But more often, betrayal is the result of conflicting loyalties, of impossible choices, of human weakness under pressure. Judas may have acted out of disillusionment or despair. Brutus believed he was saving the Republic. Thomas Becket chose duty to the church over friendship with a king. Joan of Arc was abandoned by the king she had crowned. Benedict Arnold felt unappreciated and used. Kim Philby believed in an ideology. John Dean tried to save himself from being a scapegoat. Huber Matos spoke his conscience. Informants in the civil rights movement were often coerced or misled. Sammy Gravano turned when he realized his boss would betray him. Klaus Fuchs thought he was preventing a monopoly on terrible weapons. David Radler faced prison and chose cooperation. Edward Snowden believed he was exposing wrongdoing. In each case, there are layers, complexities, reasons that go beyond simple villainy.